Hey y'all, and welcome back to There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today we're going to be talking about a case that happens overseas. So let's get into it, shall we? A phone call sets off a chain of events that solved a case nobody even knew was active. Police received a tip that William and Patricia Wycherley were buried in their own yard in Forest Town, Mansfield. So we're in England. In October of 2013, the Wycherleys owned the same house from 1987 to 1998, when the then 85-year-old William and 63-year-old Patricia simply sort of up and vanished. Neighbors, however, really didn't know them well. They said that they're a pair of recluses, and even their daughter Susan ended up acting pretty similarly to them. So much so that, again, some barely knew she was there at all. William had a reputation for being quote-unquote work shy and a coward. William was born in Shirebrook, Derbyshire, and worked at a local coal mine before he moved to Canada to work on a farm at age 17. He returned to the UK after 3 months. Supposedly, this was to dodge the draft. However, he later joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, followed by various merchant ships, sailing around the world to Australia and other countries. In 1954, he returned and lived in London. There, he met Patricia Moore, who was working as a solicitor's secretary. Patricia was born in Paignton, Devon, and grew up in Fulham, West London. Patricia ended up pregnant, and the two quickly got married in 1953, having their only child, daughter Susan, once again, months later. John and Leslie Ward were neighbors in the area who stated that if William and Patricia, they just simply kept to themselves. That if they were out back and Jerry and Leslie came out, the other couple would often head back inside. They'd go for walks together, but Patricia stayed about 5 to 10 paces behind him at all times. When the bushes needed trimming, William used nail scissors. They placed empty jam jars upside down all around their garden. William would play the organ and Patricia would sing along, which is not unusual in itself, but they would do it in very early hours of the morning. Susan ended up becoming a librarian while living at home. She met Christopher Edwards, an accountant, through a dating agency in the early 80s. According to the couple, it was a fast-burning romance, and soon after starting the relationship, they were inseparable. By 1983, the two wed, and Suzanne moved out of the family home to a flat with Christopher in Dagenham, East London. The two had similar interests, particularly in collecting Hollywood memorabilia. Eventually, this led to the two of them spending large amounts of money, racking up debt on signed photographs and similar items that they thought would be potentially of value. After the Wycherleys disappeared in 1998, Christopher would come to the house monthly, cleaning the windows and mowing the lawn, and Suzanne finally sold the house, which Sue Braunley rented, and moved in 2005. This was purportedly after a car ran into the fence, which they needed to fix. That was when Suzanne had the family mail redirected to her flat in Dagenham. 7 years later, in 2012, the Benefits sent a letter that they were coming to see William as he was turning 100. The result was a panic. Christopher stole £10,000 from his job, and the couple fled to France. They stayed in Lille, France, for almost a year before they ran out of money. And so, this is how it all happened. Christopher Edwards called his stepmother, Elizabeth, to ask for money, and during the call, he reported that there were 2 bodies buried in the backyard of Suzanne's old home. Of course, the stepmother is the one that called the police dutifully. Brian Costello Mansfield, a response officer, was given this incident. Elizabeth called the police and reported the confession. Brian called Elizabeth and reported that she came across as believable, and so an active investigation began. But it began rather slowly, as they weren't even sure that this was real. After not finding death certificates, Brian contacted the current occupant, who gave them her landlord's information. The landlord recalled buying the property, saying it was weird because it was as if the couple just vanished or disappeared. Everything was still in the house and still in place when he bought it. Brian connected with CID and they said if they can't prove anything either way, they'd need to dig up that garden. So police knocked at Sue's door shortly after, asking to, of course, dig in the garden. Police put up a white tent and got forensic archaeologists out due to the amount of time the bodies would have been in the ground. Ground scanners were brought out in the morning and scent dogs in the afternoon. They hid on the backyard. On October 9th, 2013, the bodies were unearthed. A neighbor comes forward to say Christopher was digging in the backyard around 7 a.m. and joked that he was burying his parents at the time of the disappearance, especially as Christopher dug until the hole was approximately waist deep. Soon after the bodies were unearthed, Christopher called Officer Brian on his cell phone and said he was in northern France, but Brian said that he had to be careful not to ask questions because this would be inadmissible in court. And when Christopher called a second time, Brian said that he needed to come back for an interview and that he should contact Rob Griffin, giving Christopher Rob's email address, and sure enough, Rob received an email on October 30th, 2013, reporting that Christopher and Suzanne were going to surrender to UK border forces, and can they be met at St. Pancras Station. Sure enough, the couple actually showed up when they said they would. Daryl Ennisgale, a criminal defense solicitor, was called to represent Suzanne. After the interviews, it was decided to have Christopher should have separate counseling, electing Matt Good for his defense. In November of 2019, the couple gave their story. Both said that Suzanne was visiting with her parents, drinking Bacardi, after which they all went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, Suzanne hears a loud bang and ran to her parents' room, where she found William dead next to the side of his bed. Patricia was still holding the gun. Patricia then dropped the gun, which Suzanne picked up and questioned her mother. Patricia stated that she went on about how horrible William was, and eventually, in a heated exchange, Suzanne shot her own mother. Then, covered the pair with some duvet covers. The following day, she went into town and tossed the gun. She called Christopher, telling him she argued with her parents and was coming home early. A week later, they returned to Dagenham, stopping to get fish and chips. The couple ate in the living room, and Suzanne finally admitted that her parents were dead upstairs. Christopher stated that they should call the police, but Suzanne didn't want to. She said that they wouldn't believe her, and she didn't want to be separated from Christopher. Instead, they finished dinner and watched the Eurovision Song Contest, making it around May of 1988. After midnight, they moved the bodies downstairs, and Christopher then dug those holes and buried them. Soon after, Christopher placed rhododendrons on top of them. As their stories matched, police had to continue the investigation to get to the real truth of the situation. When speaking with Sue Brani, she reported receiving bank and credit card statements, still from the couple, and another name, which she believed was Edwards. Looking into the couple, Suzanne and Christopher were spending above their means. They looked into Suzanne's financial background, finding that the day after her parents' death, Suzanne went to the bank and closed her mother's account and opened a new one in both her and her mother's name, taking out approximately £40,000 immediately. She continued to receive both her parents' pension and then ended up selling the house for a profit. The sum of that was around £200,000 of financial gain alone. Detective Chief Inspector Rob Griffin from the East Midlands Major Crime Unit told BBC after the trial, quote, "They didn't lead a particularly lavish lifestyle. It would seem that the vast majority of their money was spent on memorabilia, on authenticated autographed items, on people that they admired," end quote. Police continue their investigation, attempting to disprove the couple's story. First, looking at the timeline, they found that there was a heat wave the week the pair were supposedly lying dead in their room. From there, they went to the Museum of Natural History and spoke with an entomologist about insect activity that would have occurred at this time. Martin Hall was asked about blowfly activity, as they give the most accurate information about death. Samples were sent to the museum, confirming that there was no blowfly activity on either person, meaning the couple had likely been buried within 2 days of being murdered. It confirmed that both parents were shot, and it likely occurred during the bank holiday the week prior to the date they claimed the burial occurred. The shot placement was considered accurate when questioned. Suzanne said that she remembered the bullet shells falling off the gun. However, the gun in question was a World War II .38 caliber revolver, in which revolvers don't expel their casings. Later, during trial, the prosecution asked Christopher, in court, to mime how he would shoot someone. Christopher brought up both hands and mimed at a judge, twice, proving to the jury that Christopher indeed knew how to shoot a gun properly. But he did belong to a gun club, so this really seems like an irrelevant point. He should know how to shoot correctly. The trial itself began on June 5th, 2014. The Edwards refused to change the story, where the Crown proposed that Christopher was the man who pulled the trigger, and the couple subsequently buried them together. Both defense solicitors stood and immediately asked for a judge to accept what the Edwards admitted to save the public purse. They admitted to the theft of money, hindering the coroner, and manslaughter. Suzanne's defense was that she was sexually abused by William until she was 12, which was corroborated by her family, that William was jealous of Christopher and therefore hated him. Suzanne and Christopher Edwards again met in February of 1982, and after their first date, were pretty much inseparable, which apparently made the father very angry. For 2 weeks, the trial went on before the jury had to decide, and in just over 6 hours, they came back with a verdict. Which, if you listen to the Sean Yamade's episode, you'll know isn't usually a good sign for the defense. In this case, that also rang true. The couple were both found guilty. They were sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. Susan Edwards appealed her sentence in 2015 on the basis of quote-unquote provocation, claiming that her father had sexually assaulted her. However, that claim was dismissed in the Court of Appeal. And now I'm going to read the actual court document so that in the Crown Court Nottingham versus Christopher Edwards and Susan Edwards sentencing remarks. It is rather long, but I like that they do everything in plain language and it kind of explains the summation of everything. So this is all one giant quote. Quote, 1. A great deal has been written about you in recent days. I shall sentence you on the basis only of the evidence heard in this courtroom. 2. You have each been convicted of 2 offenses of murder. You have pleaded guilty to obstructing the coroner and to theft. 3. These are shocking crimes. William and Patricia Wycherley were the parents of Susan Edwards. In May of 1998, the 2 of you planned to shoot and kill them in their own home, and that is what you did. 4. Mr. Wycherley was 86. Mrs. Wycherley was nearly 64. They were living a quiet, reclusive life in Mansfield. They knew no one. They had as little contact as possible with other people. You knew they wouldn't be missed if they disappeared, and they weren't. 5. At the time you, Christopher Edwards, were 41. You, Susan Edwards, were 39. You were educated people. You were living a quiet life. Christopher Edwards, you were in steady employment. You had been an accounts clerk for the same firm for years. Susan Edwards, you had worked as a very young woman, but gave up your post in the 1980s and did not work after that. You had no friends and did not enjoy meeting new people. Christopher Edwards, you had work colleagues, but gave up socializing because your wife did not like it. 6. You were a completely self-contained couple. So far as you were concerned, only the 2 of you mattered. 7. Christopher Edwards, you were interested in military history. You also had an interest in and expertise in firearms, as you described during the course of the trial. Susan Edwards, you had an interest in historical military heroic figures. By the late 1990s, you were building up debts by, you say, purchasing memorabilia and stamps relating to your military heroes, things you could not afford. 8. Suzanne Edwards, 30 years ago, you told your husband that you had been sexually abused by your father when you were a little girl. You told the police the same thing, and you repeated it to the jury in trial. Because you are an accomplished liar and a fantasist, I have hesitated before accepting this. However, there is evidence wholly independent of the two of you that when you were married, William Wycherley was irrationally jealous. On reflection and balance, therefore, I accept that your father had sexually assaulted you when you were young. The abuse stopped when you were 11. You left home in your early 20s. That background may well explain why you hated him, which you did, and why you have no remorse about killing him. Given that you left home in the early 1980s, some 15 years before the murders, I cannot accept that his conduct, wholly wrong as it was, explains your decision to kill him in 1998. Having heard your account to the jury, I do not accept that your mother was ever aware of what your father had done. 9. There was something that you held against both your parents for many years. When you were 21, you left 10,000 euros by the second wife of your adored grandfather. Half of it you spent on holidays for yourself and your mother. In 1979, the other half was used to purchase of your parents' home in Edgware. Your name was on the deeds. You say that your parents emotionally blackmailed you into signing over your interest in the house to them because it had been your grandfather's wish that your mother should inherit. That was in 1983, and it is plain from your interviews and from your evidence in the trial that you considered them and still consider that your parents had deprived you of what you thought was rightfully yours. They sold that house at a profit and bought a cheaper house in Mansfield. They kept all of the proceeds. You never forgave them. Your resentment festered for years, and at the same time you were getting yourself into debt, as I have described. 10. I sentence you on the basis that each of you intended that both Mr. and Mrs. Wycherley should be shot dead. I do not know whether you acquired the murder weapon in advance, or brought it to their home, or whether you planned to use a gun owned by Mr. Wycherley. It doesn't matter. Either way, the plan was to shoot them, to kill them, and you were sure you had a gun to do so. I am sure that it was you, Christopher Edwards, who held the gun. At point-blank range, you fired 2 bullets into each of them with deadly accuracy. 15 years later, when her body was examined, one of those bullets was still lodged in the spine of Mrs. Wycherley. It must have gone through her aorta. She would have died within seconds. The evidence was that Mr. Wycherley, too, would have died quickly, though not as quickly as his wife. I am sure, Susan Edwards, that these killings were initially your idea, and that your husband agreed to carry them out. I have no doubt that you were acting together, you, Susan Edwards, encouraging Christopher Edwards at the scene, and assisting him later in concealing the bodies, to which I shall turn in a moment. You are each responsible as the other for these crimes, and I see no reason to distinguish between you on sentence. 11. Having carried out these ruthless killings, you got rid of the bodies. I use that phrase deliberately. This was in no sense a burial. There was no dignity, no respect. The point of this was to cover up the killings and move on to the next stage of your plan. 12. You wrapped the bodies in duvet covers. You dragged them down the stairs. Everyone who heard your matter-of-fact accounts of how you did that will remember them for years. Those graphic accounts were delivered with remarkable detachment. I will not repeat them. Christopher Edwards dug the hole in the back garden. As the photographs show, you folded the bodies and bundled them into a hole so that they were found with their knees bent in a fetal position, one on top of the other. You filled the hole and then planted shrubs on top. Those facts are the basis of the count of obstructing the coroner, to which you pleaded guilty shortly before trial. 13. You told the neighbors that Mr. and Mrs. Wycherley had gone on holiday, and then, in due course, they had decided to sell the house. Suzanne Edwards concocted and sent lively and imaginative notes and Christmas cards to relatives to give the impression that your parents were traveling around Ireland where the air was good. The relatives were completely taken in by your lies. No one asked a single question. You wrote letters to the doctor, surgery, when reminders came for vaccinations and refusing them on plausible grounds. 14. But before you began writing letters to maintain the fiction that your parents were still alive, you had first got on with what you were really interested in, getting their money. These facts formed on the basis of the count of theft, to which you also pleaded guilty before the trial. 15. As soon as the banks opened on the Tuesday after the bank holiday, you were in the building society doing two things just as you intended to do: opening a new account in the joint names of yourself and your dead mother, closing two accounts in the joint names of your parents, and taking every penny out of them, about 40,000 euros. You say 15,000 euros went to pay off credit card. What happened to the rest is unclear. You suggested it went on memorabilia. Who knows? Either way, it went to you and Christopher Edwards, and you spent it. True it is that after claiming Mr. Wycherley's pension for some time, you tried in October of 1998 to cancel it, but once you learned that it could be paid into a bank account, you made arrangements for that to be done. For 15 years, the two of you took and spent over 175,000 euros, which is payable to Patricia and William Wycherley in private pensions, state pensions, industrial injury benefits, winter fuel payments, and even Christmas bonus payments. Christopher Edwards was still working, and Susan Edwards was still at home. Thousands of pounds were spent on celebrity photographs, letters, and so on. Notwithstanding the pensions and the savings, you got into debt some more. You got into more debt. You obtained loans and credit cards in Mrs. Wycherley's name, and still the spending continued, and you decided the house to be sold in 2005. You forged the necessary documents and kept the proceeds of the sale, just under 67,000 euros. Christopher Edwards, you said you were against the house being sold because it would mean losing control of what you describe as the burial site. And so it would. But your concern was only for the two of you, that this loss of control might lead to discovery. No thought was given to the people who would buy the house or the family who would live in there for years, learning only in 2013 of what had gone in their home and what lay in the garden. In 2012, you fled to France when the DWP contacted Mr. Wycherley seeking a meeting before his 100th birthday. You returned to the jurisdiction voluntarily in 2013 with no money. 16. Because you committed these offenses so long ago, I must apply the sentencing regime that was in force at the time. I must not specify a minimum term greater than which the Secretary of State would have notified at the time. The provisions of Schedule 21 of the CGA 2003, which identify a number of starting points, were not then in force. The single starting point for the minimum term for murder in 1998 was identified by the Lord Chief Justice as 14 years, and that is a starting point I take. 17. Mr. Enoch and Mr. Howaker have reminded me that I should have regard to the practice statements that followed in 2000 and 2002, most recently in Practice Statement 2002, which contained three starting points: a normal starting point of 12, a higher starting point of 15 to 16, and a further starting point of 20 years for the offenses described as especially grave, including terrorism cases. This is not such a case they submit. This is not a case which in 2002 would have merited a starting point of 20 years in respect with 15 to 16 year starting point. I note paragraph 49.19 of the direction, quote, a substantial upward adjustment may be appropriate in most cases. In suitable cases, result might even be a minimum term of 30 years, end quote. This chimes with the observations of Lord Bingham in 1997 that a punitive term of longer than 30 years would be very rare indeed. 18. Lord Bingham identified 8 mitigating factors, none of which are present here. Of the list of 11 factors requiring a sentence more severe than the norm, no fewer than 6 are present here. This was a planned shooting for the gain of 2 victims, one of whom was in his 80s. Once they were dead, their bodies were dumped in the hole in the backyard to avoid discovery, and then the elaborate charade began, pretending they were alive for 15 years. This is not a question of ticking boxes. It is a question of accurately assessing the seriousness of these offenses and your culpability for them. I have considered with care all that has been urged on your behalf, Christopher Edwards, by Mr. Enoch and on your behalf, Susan Edwards, by Mr. Howaker, but the facts of the case are so serious, and your culpability so high as to require me to move a very great deal higher than the 14-year starting point to which I have already referred. 19. You were in your late 50s. You are going to spend most, if not all, of the rest of your lives in prison. I accept that prison has been very difficult for both of you. Susan Edwards, I accept that you are particularly isolated and will remain so throughout your sentence. Christopher Edwards, Susan Edwards. 20. The sentence I impose upon each of you is the same. On each count of murder, life imprisonment with a minimum term to be served before you are considered for parole of 25 years. For the offense of obstructing a corner, 5 years imprisonment. For the offense of theft, 4 years imprisonment. All those sentences will run concurrently with a minimum term you will serve before you are considered for parole, therefore, is 25 years. End quote. And I know that's a lot, but it explains the entire reasoning behind their sentencing. And again, it gave some pretty good, clear language where I feel like a lot of times the legal jargon can be pretty heavy and hard to understand. And with that, the two of them are serving their time in prison over in England and will likely remain there for the rest of their natural life. And again, to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.